So hello everyone and welcome to the first AAR conversation of 2021. And today is particularly special because we have our fellows and residents now, and both of our speakers are actually living on the AAR campus. So we're finally all together. So today we have our director, Avinoam Shalem, and current resident in medieval studies, David Nirenberg, who will be in conversation about ghettos as part of our series this year, focusing on the city. Avinoam came to the American Academy from Columbia University, where he's the Regio Professor of History of the History of the Arts of Islam, and he's an art historian whose main field of interest concerns artistic interactions in the Mediterranean basin, the migration of objects, and medieval aesthetics. And he's published extensively on medieval Islamic, Jewish, and Christian art. Today, he'll be in conversation with our newly arrived resident, David Nirenberg. David wears many hats at the University of Chicago. He's the Deborah R and Edgar D Jannotta Distinguished Service Professor of Medieval History and Social Thought in the Department of History, but he is currently serving as the Dean of the Divinity School there. Much of David's work is focused on the ways in which Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cultures think about each other. Among his numerous books is Communities of Violence, Persecution of Minorities in the Middle Ages from 1998, where he studied social interaction between the three groups in order to understand the role of violence in shaping the possibilities of coexistence. Another of his books, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, studies the work of pagan, Christian, Muslim, and secular thinkers about Jews and Judaism, and that's from 2013. I'm not naming all of his books. And then in a book called Neighboring Faith, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, Medieval and Modern from 2014, he brought past methodologies together in order to show how in multi-religious societies, interactions between the lived experiences and conceptual categories shape how the adherents of all three religions perceive themselves, but also each other. And he's currently at work on a book he's calling Adam's Seed, A World History of Race and Religion in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So Avinoam and David will discuss their shared interests by focusing on the notion of urban ghettos. But before we start, let me just explain how we're going to do this. David will start with a short presentation of 10 or 15 minutes. Then he and Avinoam will have a conversation, after which we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And you can type your questions in the chat box. And if you want to direct them to a particular speaker, you can let me know in the chat box, or if you just want to throw it out there for either one of them, that's fine as well. I will then repeat the questions that I read from the chat box. So with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thanks, Lynn. And I actually want to begin with a more general thanks to the American Academy. In some way, being here in this very strange time and seeing the extraordinary measures that the Academy has taken to open its library to the city and to scholars, and to open its grounds to its fellows and to visitors like me, reminds one, even more than one is reminded in normal times, of the importance that an institution like this plays in the production of knowledge and art and in the kind of formation of the collective intellect. So I think in this pandemic present hour, it's above all, we should thank the institution that has done so much to preserve thought through many difficult times, including this one. And so thanks so much for the invitation. I was really grateful to Avinoam for suggesting that we talk about ghettos. And since the theme is the city, even though I actually don't know anything about ghettos. The reason I don't know anything about ghettos is because the word itself is very specific to a moment in history, namely Italy in the mid-16th century, when this Italian word was assigned to a new urban realities. historians have real trouble with words. It's either we get confused because words change their meaning, and so we can't just say, well, one word means the same thing all the time, or we have the problem that often words don't exist for things, but that doesn't mean that things don't exist. So racism or anti-Semitism are very late words in lexicography, but that doesn't mean that those concepts or that similar kinds of action didn't exist before. And ghetto is one of those words that it really emerges in Italian, but it applies to a concept that we know it was very powerful in societies before. So that's a challenge every historian has. And so I apologize for being a historian because it means I'm going to get all hung up on the words. The other thing I want to apologize for is having so little to say about Rome. The American Academy in Rome, and Rome the city, and Rome has a ghetto, again, founded in 1555 by Paul IV, with this beautifully entitled bull called Cum Nimis Absurdum, since it is absurd that Jews who are through their own fault made eternal slaves by God should wander through the city. We therefore create this space. But that's very late in the history of the kind of process that we're, or even the object of thought that that Avinoam and I want to discuss. So I was thinking, well, how can I make Rome the center of the story? And it occurred to me that, of course, Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. That was in Rome. And the Fourth Lateran Council did something really important in the history of segregation. That is, it promulgated Canon 68 about the treatment of Jews and also Muslims, in which it demanded the segregation of Jews. It specifically spoke about the need to ensure that Jews have different names, look different, dress different, etc., and are separated from Christians. And it gave a reason for that necessity of separation. The reason was largely sexual, so that Jews and Christians not mix sexually. So I thought, well, I can say, look, I'm going to show you that that was a really motive power through the formation of ghettos in the Middle Ages. I can say it all started here at the Fourth Lateran Council. But historians also should have an allergy to origins, because usually whenever they say something started somewhere, it's just because they don't know something about something that happened before, or some other culture, or some other part of the world. So let me just point out that I can't even really say that. After all, the Almohads had engaged in mass conversions of Jews in North Africa and Spain in the 1140s and 50s. And by like 1184, they were very convinced that they had a problem with these converts and that they had to mark them with degrading clothes, yellow objects, separate them from Muslims who weren't converts, etc. So we might want to argue that there is an interconnection between the kind of thinking happening at the Fourth Lateran Council and happening just a few decades before in a rapidly expanding empire that conquered much of the West, the Almohad Empire. So, and certainly when we're talking about a place, the only place in Europe where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived extensively and intensively together in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, namely the Iberian Peninsula, you can't really easily separate Islamic from Christian influences. So I'm not going to claim that we can say where the origin of the kind of process of segregation that produces the kind of ghetto that Avinoam is sitting in front of, which is the Venetian one, where it began, but I will just say that it borrowed ideas that were available from two great cultures, the Islamic and the Catholic, that were thinking about the problem of heterogeneity, difference, in urban space. And in particular, we're pushed to think about that problem by dramatic changes in society, sometimes mass conversion, commercialization, all kinds of dramatic changes. But the place where you can really see this happening is medieval Spain. And that's partly because that's the place where Muslims, Jews, and Christians are really living cheek by jowl. And largely it's Christians and Jews who are living most intensively in urban environments. Muslims are to some degree in suburbs, but also largely in rural environments. So although some of the dynamics I'm going to talk about apply to some Muslim communities, like in Murcia, for example, by and large, they really develop in thinking about Judaism, and particularly in the 14th and 15th century. And it's a process that is always driven by the kind of erotic aesthetics that I just described from the Fourth Lateran Council. That is, all of the segregations, or many of the segregations, are going to be justified by thinking about the need to separate Jews from Christians for reasons that have to do with, I'll call it the erotic, that is the danger of sexuality between them, and that erotic danger brings with it the danger of what sin, the danger of God's anger, because God doesn't tolerate well when his enemies and his people are mixing. The Jews, the enemies of Christ, and the Christians are mixing. So then the idea that if you don't have this kind of segregation, God gets angry, and one of the consequences of that anger is what we're living through right now, pandemic. So disease, plague, famine, other forms of collective punishment. So the process of segregation, well, I'll call it ghettoization, is a process that's driven by ideas of sexual mixing, ideas of infection, but it's also driven by logics of just strategic interaction. One of the things that I found fascinating when I worked intensively in the archives of the Crown of Aragon was to see how so much of what drove segregation was an attempt to bring religious difference to bear on everyday problems. Someone opens a window in their house that now looks into your courtyard and allows them to see you when you're sunbathing or when your daughters are not wearing their veils. So you bring an argument about religion before and argue that that wall needs to be closed, segregation needs to be maintained, because it's an attack on God's honor for Jews to see into Christian spaces. So you see these kind of optic elements, which I think are common across all the long history of urban ghettos. You have a problem with the sewer of a neighbor running through your property. Sewers, big problem in the Middle Ages. So you make arguments about the risk of Jewish infection to Christian people, that Jewish feces are contagious and dishonoring and therefore must be segregated from the Christian. You hear sounds from the synagogue, and this applies also to the mosque. And you argue that segregation is necessary so that Christians not be sonically assaulted. The sonic element of segregation and ghettoization in urban spaces, I think, is also very common across and continues to this day. So all of these elements, on the one hand, the kind of argument about sexual fear and sin and punishment. On the other hand, this kind of strategic uses. And finally, I think the last element is the constant presence of violence. So when, for example, during the Black Death, so a pandemic situation, pandemics are on everybody's mind. A Christian funeral procession is walking by Barcelona's Jewish neighborhood, not ghetto, just neighborhood, and a piece of thatch falls off a roof and lands on the procession. Was that a deliberate act? It leads to an attack on the Jewish quarter. So next step, well, let's fortify the Jewish quarter. If there's going to be these attacks, we need to have fortification. So you find minorities auto-segregating, asking permission to build walls, gates, etc. So these kind of the strategic, the theological, the aesthetic, and violence drive these processes in which all sides may be jockeying to either push segregation or not push segregation. That segregation itself, it can be a catalyst to greater and greater othering, greater and greater distance between groups. So it's not an accident that it's usually with enormous acts of violence that then are then followed by large acts of segregation. It's after the massacres of 1391, for example, that the desire to separate Jews, the remaining Jews and Christians even more, becomes pronounced in Spanish society. And that's when you get the formation of these legally bounded quarters that Jews are not to leave. In fact, you get the argument, Benedict XIV, I think is, not Benedict XIV, but a Benedict, an earlier Benedict, argues that, doesn't argue, decrees that if Jews are found outside of their quarter in the Crown of Aragon, in the Christian quarter at night, they should have, male Jews, they should have their feet cut off. St. Vincent Ferrer argues that no Christian who's neighbor to a Jew can be a good Christian, and demands total segregation, total ghettoization, in order to prevent the mixing of Jews and Christians. And again, the argument is, on the one hand, about theology. On the other hand, it's also highly sexualized. So Vincent is famous, among other things, for preaching that unless you have this massive segregation, Jews and Muslims will have sex with Christians. And indeed, he says, there are many Christians who think that their child is theirs, when in fact, it's a child of a Muslim or a Jew. And in those kinds of moments, you find hyper patrolling of these new boundaries. So the process of ghettoization is a process that's driven by all of these different elements. On the one hand, the infection, fear of infection. On the other hand, negotiating the everyday issues of urbanism. On the third hand, negotiating deep theological differences that become increasingly entrenched. On the fourth hand, handling or trying to control violence, sometimes in ways that then produce more violence by marking the quarter which you can attack. All of these aspects of the ghetto, I think, are things that are a little, that remain familiar to later histories of the ghetto. And it's only with, in fact, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the migration of many of them to Italy, that you find the formation in Italy of these kinds of quarters, which is itself part of the process of dealing with the collapse of pluralism that had existed in Spain. So the history of ghettos is a kind of intertwined history of, on the one hand, pluralism and efforts and uses of segregation, distinction to maintain pluralism, consequences of that actually destroy pluralism, exiles and diasporas, which create new kind of migrations and new pressures in new places that then borrow similar techniques to deal with similar problems. So that's a kind of potted history of my sense of why the ghetto is such a useful concept for understanding the management of difference. I'll call it the management of, I don't mean to sound in any way liberal or neoliberal, but I just mean either the management of difference, either in the interest of maintaining the possibility of difference of Jews or Muslims in your community, in a Christian community, or of erasing that possibility, containing it with the ultimate end of effacing it and eliminating it, both of which exist. So I would say that the ghetto, we can't, the medieval ghetto, we can't valorize negatively or positively. It's always in the middle of these processes whose outcomes are contingent. Sometimes they are, when I say they are conducive to pluralism, sometimes they're conducive to great violence and even the elimination or extermination of difference in a society. I'll leave you with one last anecdote. My wife and I had the good fortune to be able to rent a beautiful 14th century building in the Jewish Kai of Barcelona. And it's actually a building that's in my dissertation. I didn't know it, but it is because, or if not my dissertation, one of my later articles, because I found in the archive of the Crown of Aragon a document in which the later purchaser of that building after the massacres of 1391, a purchaser in the 1420s, wants to bring a lawsuit to get his money back because he has discovered that the well in the courtyard of the building is full of skeletons. That is, full of the skeletons of the Jews who were killed and thrown into the well when the Jewish quarter was destroyed in 1391 and the ghetto was turned into a Christian neighborhoods. Hence, this Christian had bought this property. So that takes this last issue, the way in which ghettos are also spaces, medieval ghettos became quickly spaces of memory. That is to say, in this case, the Jewish occupation was to some degree forgotten, but the conquest, the elimination of their presence was memorialized. Anyone who's been to any of the great Jewish kais, Jewish quarters of the Iberian Peninsula, knows that often you will find a synagogue turned into a church after the massacres of 1391 to commemorate the elimination of that difference, right? And of course, today, those precise places are sites of a different kind of memorialization, namely tourism. And I think we'll probably have a chance to talk about that aspect of ghettos, medieval ghettos as urban phenomena, but also modern ones. And maybe that takes me to a concluding comment. Words change their meaning. And although today we still speak of Jewish ghettos, and we can speak of a ghetto in Venice or in Rome, or even in Warsaw, so in mid-20th century ghettos, and we understand each other and we allow that kind of language. Other applications of the word ghetto to other spaces of thought have gone through more permutations. So, for example, the application of the word ghetto, its extension from ghettos for Jews to ghettos for other minorities, and for example, ghettos for African Americans after the Civil War and the Great Migrations in the US. Now, today, that word has a very different set of valences in the US, and we wouldn't speak of ghettos in the same way. We wouldn't use the word ghetto to be applied neutrally to those kinds of spaces. So some of the cognitive work that Ghetto did, say, for American history in, let's say, the 20th century, it no longer does in American history. And that's another aspect of this concept of ghetto that is difficult and challenging in a sense that it's proven very useful for thinking in certain moments and, if not counterproductive, problematic for thinking in others. I really look forward, Avinoam, to our conversation. I must say the privilege of being able to speak to you about such things is a great one.
That's it. David, thank you so much. You already opened the whole spectrum of our conversation today. And what I will try to do now is to go to specific point that actually you mentioned and try to elaborate and get deeper into points that you have mentioned. I'm very happy because that you are here and opening also the program with the fellow on the city, and especially with this specific topic, which is so much embedded in the idea of a sort of an urban form that we can speak about it. It's almost like a container within the container, which is called the city. We have a kind of a idea of containment and the creation of an urban space that is made, I think in terms of object that I'm working with, as if there is a box within, you can find some other boxes organized in a way that create a kind of a division. I know, and you made it very clear that we are not going to decipher the whole story of the ghetto, and nevertheless, we are not, and definitely not going to go into the question of the origin and the beginning of, but what I want to create in this conversation is a kind of the ghetto as a model to understand paradoxes that are happening in this space. And let me start with the whole question of periphery and the center. I'm trying to think, if I'll go and think about the specific moment that we get an information about building a wall in order to segregate the whole nation, it will go into the big story of Alexander the Great creating the walls around Gog and Magog. I mean, here it is a specific act of creating a ghettoization specific space that is going to be enclosed at the periphery of the world, because you want also to push these people into the periphery, into the invisible end of a specific space. And in some cases, it fits very well with Venice. If you look at the map of Venice and look at the space of the ghetto is definitely not next to San Marco. It's not next to any major building or church of the city. It is located actually at the verge of the city, as if there is a wish to create invisibility in the ghetto. Of course, other spaces, we have the idea of the ghetto built or created in the inner city. And sometimes, like in Muslim spaces, as you know, if we go from Spain to Morocco, you will find the ghetto, so to speak, the Jewish quarter next even to the Qala, to the place of power, next to the governor of this city, or even the caliph. So first of all, these two paradoxes, before we get into the other ones that I want, can you elaborate, or can you think more on the idea of periphery and center in terms of the ghetto, and even visibility and invisibility?
No, it's a very important question, because in a way, the Venetian example represents a dramatic change. In the medieval communities, the Jews, this depends on, there's a difference between Jews and Muslims here. So, but let me first talk about Jews. Jews were very much settled around centers of power. So, for example, around the cathedral, very commonly, or sometimes around an episcopal or a royal center of authority. So they were often right in the middle of the city. But of course, medieval cities were very used to to being separated into jurisdictional spaces. Whereas, of course, Muslims in Spain were very often ejected from the centers of cities and settled in the suburbs of Raval or outside in the country. So there clearly were different Christian strategies for dealing with different minorities. And of course, there was a kind of path dependency. Some of these Jewish settlements in medieval cities in Germany, in the Rhineland, in Iberia, were very ancient and had been settled around these foci, the centers of the city, from very early. So that's a very different method than the Italian one. Even the Roman ghetto was sent across to the edges of the river and across to a floodplain, right? Part of the reason for that is that the medieval ghettos were, or medieval Jews anyway, and Muslims too in Spain, were thought of as permanent inhabitants. It's true that eventually in 1492, Spain did expel its Jews, but for millennium, it had treated them as permanent inhabitants. That's not the case in Italy. By the time, it's the case for some Italian Jewish communities, but by the time that by the 16th century, many settlements of Jews are temporary. They are allowed to settle in a ghetto or in a neighborhood or in an area by a privilege which is supposed to expire. So the idea isn't one of a kind of permanent, it's marginal in temporality too. It's not only in space. So there are very different conceptions of the place of heterogeneity within the city state or within the city.
Yeah, and back to visibility and invisible in the ghetto, there is a great paradox that, I was reading the recent book of Dana Katz on the Venetian ghetto, and in her introduction, she put it so clearly at the beginning. She's starting with a citation that I have here in front of my eye of Rainer Maria Rilke, who is, in Venice, and he is looking at the ghetto, the same ghetto that is behind me here, and you can see that what is happening here, the moment you start to put the Jews together in a small space, there is no other way but to start to grow to the sky, to start to grow and to create buildings that are actually the highest building in Venice now. So what is happening that if we think about visibility, the ghetto, which was tried to make the Jews invisible, created a kind of a visibility to the ghetto with the high buildings of 8 stores in the city of Venice. So he's saying something like that. The Venetian reduced the area of the ghetto so that its Jewish families were forced to build their houses in the vertical dimension, one of on the roof of another. And the city, which did not lie on the sea, grew slowly into a space of heaven, as though it were another sea. And all around the square where the well was, building grows in dizzy perpendicularity like the walls of a giant tower. So what is happening here is a kind of a visibility. And in the book, she's even going farther and saying that it comes into a specific moment where they start to have the commanding view in the city. They could see much more of the city from their windows outside into another space, which create a specific power that will be blocked again by the Venetian. They will ask them to block some windows that actually produce this kind of view. So I'm also thinking about the visibility and invisibility of what you are doing when you are creating a space like that. When you condense it, you create actually visibility, not to speak about if you ask them to wear specific clothes or something like that. So it's segregation in order to put them aside, but visibility as a result. Do you have any other example of that in Spain?
Well, I think that one of the things that, I mean, I do think that the panoptic aspect that Dana has put to such good work for Venice is something of an accident of urbanism. And I think it developed over time. It didn't begin as a virtue from the Jewish point of view and as a vice from the Christian one. And in the medieval ghettos, since they were largely, there were no panoramas. You were surrounded by building. I don't know if anyone's ever walked through the Calle of Girona or Barcelona or any of the medieval quarters that still remain for most of these cities. Anything that's wide open was created in the 19th century by people ripping things down. It didn't exist in the Middle Ages. But the visibility is really important in yet another way. The segregation of difference into these spaces, and then the marking of those spaces jurisdictionally. So outside of the ghetto of Valencia, the king had the gates built with his coat of arms, so everyone would know that they were entering property of the king when they entered the Jewish quarter. And when he had gallows built outside the gates, so everyone would know that if they violated that space, it was hyper-marked, as hyper-patrolled, as hyper-protected, right? None of that, of course, protected or succeeded in protecting the Jews of Valencia in 1391 when they were massacred, precisely because they were viewed as hyper-protected, symbolic of a royal power that needed to be attacked. So that's another form of visibility. The yellow badge, but also the kind of segregation is a sign of, I won't call it privilege, because if this is a privilege, it comes with a stigma. That is the stigma of slavery, technically slavery. That's why when in Cum Nimis Absurdum, it's, they are eternal slaves. So that privilege I wouldn't call it privilege, but I'd call it hyper protection or protection. That segregated protection makes also a form of visibility that also potentiates violence. So it's one of those paradoxes that you're pointing to.
I wonder, coming to the next paradox, it would be segregation in a ghetto. It has also some values, and some people are even writing in the early modern era about it. I'm thinking on Francesco Sansavino, 1581, is saying, I prefer to live in Venice rather than in any other part of Italy, since they are not subject to violence or tyranny. Here they are, as they are elsewhere, reposing in most singular peace. They enjoy the city almost like a true promised land. And that's interesting. Now we are getting into even a comparison of the ghetto to the promised land, which, you can take it, the metaphor of the ghetto, and say, here is Israel is a kind of a ghetto for the Jews as well as a promised land there. But I'm just thinking about the paradox of people who are preferring now to live in a Jewish environment, but to what cost? What is the cost? Where is the thing that is probably doing a specific balance? He's not telling us what he's not able to do in the ghetto. But so I'm just thinking about this paradox of, we think of the ghetto as something totally negative because we all are embedded in our iconic image after the 20th century of Warsaw ghetto, or image which is much more embedded in another story of history. But here we get a kind of another look at the ghetto, which is, as you say, an urban solution for maybe a cosmopolitan city.
Well, that's why I think I tried to stress that the ghetto can't be called positive or negative. In some ways, for example, it is clearly an effort to create a space within which Jews can be tolerated and protected, or not only Jews, other minorities can also be ghettoized. And in that sense, we might want to think of it as akin to the Islamic funduk, where you create a special space in which foreigners or people who are non-Muslim or can be kept and protected and can lodge and flourish for shorter periods of time, of course. At the same time, it's also clearly an instrument of oppression. Most ghettos in the 16th and later centuries, whether we're speaking in Germany or in Italy, will have strict population limits and will also have strict chronological limits on how long these people are actually allowed to be present. Even if those limits are then renewed or observed, they're clearly also instruments of oppression. We could argue that that kind of marginalization, segregation, and jurisdictional separation made possible all kinds of what we might call the maintenance of traditional structures of religious authority, et cetera, and that it's only when those break down with the Enlightenment, and in particular with Napoleon, that that coherence of the Jewish community also breaks down. So you could argue that that's a benefit of the ghetto, if you want. But at the same time, it's also clear that these ghettos did attract an enormous amount of effort, often punctuated, but so not always, but often, from the surrounding society to destroy them, and often successfully. So there's not. I wouldn't say it's very hard to do an accounting of whether the ghetto is a good thing or a bad thing. Just like today, I mean, I think we ourselves are wrestling in contemporary. So I would never compare the pre-modern with the contemporary, because in many ways, our democratic ideals, for example, don't tolerate many of the forms for tolerating difference that the pre-modern used, like caste systems, millet systems, segregation, etc. At the same time, there's a lot of discussion in the present about, and there's a lot of auto-segregation in the present too. And we see this sometimes with Orthodox religious communities, but also with ethnic minorities and linguistic minorities, attempts to, precisely because segregation is a form for maintaining, preserving aspects of a culture, we often find efforts at auto-segregation. And then there's this whole question that every democratic society today is facing about what's the legitimacy of that, what are the limits of that. And of course, today we have massive segregation that is not either, it's not auto-segregation, it's not self-chosen, and it's also not legally enforced. It's an economic process of inequality and poverty that creates massive segregation in the U.S., probably, and especially in the U.S., probably greater than or more total in some ways than in some pre-modern societies. So it's
Sorry. Or even I'm thinking of labor segregation in some other cities which are going through a speedy development, like in the Gulf area, and so on. But we are trying now to come to the last point, because we want to leave also space for the discussion. And the last point that I wanted to speak about is the whole question of the ghetto as a commodity, as a product that is being now created to promote tourism, to have a sellable product that could be translated into the making of money. And I'm just, thinking of I'm trying to combine it not only with the question of what is happening today in cities that are creating Jewish ghettos that are built only for tourism with restaurants and so on, but I'm trying also to think on the making of the ghetto as a kind of exotica. And I must say, it takes me to something that I've been also talking about some years ago here at the American Academy in one of the conferences, and it takes me back to a specific carnival of the making of Orient in Florence in 1878, in the inner city next to what today is the Piazza della Repubblica, in Florence, where the Jewish ghetto was. So before the destruction of the Jewish ghetto, the city of Venice, by the end of the 19th century, creating an Oriental carnival and turning the cities of the ghetto into a kind of a kasbah of an Arab city, with people dressed like Oriental and moving within the city. So I'm thinking of the perception of the ghetto already as a kind of a medieval Oriental construct that is being done now in the 19th century up to the moment of today of tourism. I wonder if you want to elaborate on this idea of the commercialization of ghettos today.
Yeah, I mean, it is I must admit it's a phenomenon I've read numerous anthropologists writing about it, and I still don't really understand it, other than people like to travel and people do what is called heritage tourism. That is, they like to imagine that they're traveling to their own past in some way. And this has turned every Iberian construction project into an opportunity to find some abandoned mikveh from the Middle Ages, or some object that would allow you to then say, come tourists, come here. But I'd say that, in a way, we're living through a much larger phenomenon of economization of such a culture. I said that we would not apply the word ghetto today to, for example, Hispanic population centers in Chicago or in Houston, or to African American concentrations, urban concentrations in New York, Chicago, or Houston, or any other city. Although those concentrations are sometimes super segregated, and economically so. But we're also living through a moment in which that segregation is being commercialized. The culture of that segregation is being commercialized in ways that dwarf any of the kind of heritage industry we're talking about. Just think about, as one of my colleagues, Alexa Herlins, just mentioned to me today, she said, well, hip hop is probably the greatest example of the commercialization of a culture of urban difference. And it's a massive phenomenon today, that is also today a very complex phenomenon within the kind of dynamic structures of race and culture in the US and in much of the world at this moment.
Thank you, David. I think that in that moment, we can move back to Lynn, who will now open the forum for a discussion. So back to you, Lynn. Thank you, David.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a number of questions here. Now, a couple of different people a couple of different questions that are more factual, I guess. A number of people want to know the citation for that book that you were discussing on the Venice Ghetto. Oh, the book that you were discussing on the Venice Ghetto. What is the citation, the author? And okay, you're muted.
It's Dana Katz, K-A-T-Z.
Yeah, Dana Katz, yeah.
Okay, and then the other one that a couple of people have asked separately is, why is it the color yellow that was often used to mark Jews?
I'd love to hear your answer.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Avinoam is coming in and out.
My knowledge about colors goes, sorry, my connection is very bad here. Just a moment. I'm sorry, I cannot answer this question. I mean, my knowledge about colors, the last article that I wrote something about color was about red. I can speak about red in late antique and early Islam, but I'm sorry, the yellow will have to wait.
It is very, so the Almohads, for example, also used yellow. I think Ibn Hazm talks about yellow. It's, it's a color that's associated with the Jews in the Islamic and in the Christian tradition. I don't know, when it starts. As you can tell, one of the reasons I keep on saying I don't talk about origins is because I don't know enough to talk about origins. But it is curious that the Jews are associated with any number of things, colors, animals. So we have whole books written about how the Jew became associated with the scorpion. Vegetables, there's a long history of Jews being identified with eggplants, even in 8th century Yemen, so in early Islamic Yemen, but all the way through to Spain of the Inquisition and to North Africa in the 19th century. So these things do have long histories. Each of these identifications, even if we don't always know all the threads that weave those histories.
So two people have, Paul Parks and Sandra Weddle, have written in and said that yellow was also used to mark prostitutes in Venice. I mean, they don't know what the connection is, but that's an interesting observation.
I mean, one argument that was used in the Middle Ages itself was an argument about Jewish cowardice and yellow being a color associated with cowardice. But, again, this is a 15th century argument, and I don't know how.
So here's one from Rick Miller. Populations that are ghettoized are geographically constrained, but they are brought into the city usually because their labor or services are necessary for the operation of the city. What labor and services did Venice's Jews provide that other segments of the population were not supplying? I know in Rome, they tended to be deal in rags, and today near the ghetto in Rome, you have a lot of fabric shops. But I don't know anything about Venice. No one wants to take that one up. Let's see.
No, but the questioner is absolutely right that in many of these societies, these segregations serve the maintenance of economic functions. And it's not, I mean, this is well known, of course, and Weber has written about it, many people have written about it, but in places like Iberia, those functions were not only money lending, there were all kinds of things like coral and dice making, coral manufacture, silk weaving, many different, depending on the city, many different trades were usually focused on in the hands of a minority group or another. So in Aragon, Muslims were very often specialists in blacksmithery or in or in veterinary science. They're very, very, very specialized by caste or by ethnicity or by religion. So in that sense, the questioner is spot on. I'm sure something similar is true in Venice. It's just that Avinoam and Lynn and I are not really that learned about Venice.
Yeah, I mean, again, I could say something about the Jews in the Arab lands in medieval time, and then Even if you go through famous travelers like Benjamin of Tudela and looking at his diary, you get the information that Jews are mainly in these areas, are involved in the production of glass, for example. So also in the Roman period, in spaces out of on the outskirts of the city of Cologne, you have, of course, the glass manufacturer, and you have the Jewish settlement around this area, because all this production of glass, or like in the ghetto, one of the etymological proposal for the ghetto, which is about the ghetto is coming from the word ghetto, which is the casting place for metal, the fabric for casting metal, that was actually located not far away from the Jewish ghetto, outside on the periphery of the city. All these places that has to do with fire, are like glass, like metal, are spaces that are usually located outside the city because of the fear of war. But if the Jews are involved in the production of glass, of course, around this workshop, you start to create a Jewish settlement. So there is also a connection between the profession and the space. But I'm not sure about Venice, if there is a connection between the two. I can say that in Arab lands, in many cities, we know of glassmakers who are probably Jews, who bringing this knowledge, not only keeping this knowledge secret, because they want to give it from father to son in order to keep the tradition within their community and not to give the knowledge further to other people.
So here's another one. Why can we not use ghetto and ghettoization for the US urban situation? Aren't the same fears of contagion and particularly sexual fears still operative in American fantasies?
Well, that's exactly why I stress those fears in the medieval material, because I do want to draw all kinds of comparisons with the present. However, I think if you look at the use of the term ghetto in contemporary scholarship or in contemporary discourse in the US, you'll find it's undertaking a semantic shift, and that it's more negatively valorized than neutral. So to use the word ghetto would be to imply a value judgment that would not be easily tolerated, right, amongst academics now or amongst their audience, which was not, of course, is not the case when you talk about Jewish ghettos, where that kind of semantic shift hasn't taken place.
Yeah. But maybe, we spoke about it, David, that at least there is another way of dealing with the ghetto as a metaphor. And, if you took it as a metaphor and then work with that, so I can understand where this question is coming from. If we speak about the Harlem ghetto or yeah, any other, I'm sorry, in a kind of a metaphorical way. So it is interesting because it takes back, as this person asking, to the whole question of erotic and and segregation back into our society. Not to speak, in my case, of the Orientalism and exotic even later.
So I was just going to report a question from, I think, a friend of both of yours, Teo Ruiz, who was with us at the American Academy last year. And he says yellow, as opposed to gold, was one of the devalued colors in the Middle Ages, and it was associated with faithlessness.
With what?
Faithlessness.
So lack of faith, presumably Christian faith. So I just wanted to report that from Teo. Here's one. Would you comment on the relationship of the Doge to the Jews? There was a 16th century Torah burning which brought the rabbis from Mainz to settle this violation. I don't know the history of that. Does that ring any bells?
I think we are once again running up against the non-Venetian specialty of of the panel.
There's like,
Lynn, I think Avinoam and I meant to talk about ghetto as a metaphor for cognition, meaning also for how we isolate parts of our knowledge are ghettoized, etc. The modern term or the contemporary term we use all the time is siloing. But I think we could have ghetto is a metaphor for how our own disciplinary structures in universities, in fact, maybe for what the ivory tower itself is becoming. These metaphors are all available to us. Yeah.
and it's becoming more and more. I mean, with each sort of sub-discipline sort of going into itself.
So maybe that's why we have so little to offer to those who want to know something about Venice, that we've all been ghettoized into different specialties.
Right. Given that we're discussing the establishment of ghettos in an urban context, would you consider the segregation of ethno-religious minority populations into entirely separate urban spaces to be part of the same process as the development of the ghettos, e.g. the Muslim colony at Lucera in the Sicilian Regno?
Yeah, again, I mean, it's this question that tries to create a kind of a linearity in the history of making segregation to communities. I mean, I could go back into depictions of the cities in Babylon, where you can see a city divided into quarter that are actually creating different society within them, because it's based on the idea of a military camp with its own 3 or 5 division that are creating the military power. And each division is, of course, from another region, from another race that is creating it. And that will create the beginning of a city. We can always go to this kind of a long tradition of creating within the city containers that contain, for the benefit of the people living within, a specific space for them. The question is what we want to raise here in this discussion is the moment that it began to be a space now for Jews within the urban community that we are talking here about. But I see the lengths of the possibility, but I don't think we can put one as a stone in the building of the history of the other so clearly.
No, but I love the question, because it the way I think we should think about really any concept is that it invites us to apply it and then to find the limits of its application. In some ways, it'll help us think about something, and in some ways, it won't. And the Muslim colony of Lucera, we could think about how does this help us work, just like we could today. I'm reminded when I was in the landscape of near Haifa, and seeing an Arab village, Arab Israeli village, and right next to I'll simplify, a Jewish Israeli village, and the sonic competition between them, the way in which the muezzins loudspeakers were aimed at the Jewish, and the kind of all kinds of things that reminded me of complaints and litigation that I see in the Middle Ages in these segregated spaces. But of course, there's real limits to that reminder or to that analogy, and then we explore the limits. And the limits teach us something too. One of the big limits being, for example, whether we live in democratic societies or all kinds of, what are the forces of violence and of inequality. There's all kinds of limits. But I do think that the question does invite us to say, well, how would the concept help us here? And then what are its limitations? And I think that's what a concept like ghetto that has been so important and has changed in so many ways over time, invites us to do as historians or as scholars who want to understand both the present and many different pasts.
Yeah, I could even, if we come to think about it, about this separation, when we look even at the ghetto itself, and even the ghetto in Venice, you will see that within the ghetto, there are another invisible walls that create even the separation between Jews coming from the Ottoman Empire to Venice, to the Jews coming from Spain, to the Jews coming from over the Alps. So they create their own synagogues, they create their own spaces within. The way that even, you know, a Muslim Arab society, Muslim Arab Christian society is made up of different quarter. Look at Jerusalem as the best example for that, from the Armenian to the Muslim, to the Jewish, to the Orthodox, Russian, to you have all these kind of other invisible walls that create spaces that we are moving so quickly between the borders. But if we are coming to think about it, it is interesting to see the moment where you move from one place to another and what does entail.
I think we've probably come to the end of our time. We're a little bit after 7 o'clock. I would just tell you though that your conversation generated 52 questions or comments. So, and for all of you who I did not ask your question or announce some of your observations, we will print out a record of all of this, which we will give to both of the speakers so that they can read all of your reactions to their conversation. So thank you very much, Avinoam and David. That was a really excellent way to start off 2021 and to initiate our year with the fellows.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Avinoam.
Thank you, David.
And thank you all for being here. I just want to assure you that all those sirens and horns you heard coming over Zoom are genuine Roman sirens and horns.
They are, they are.
Yeah, as opposed to what I have at the back, yes. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for taking
all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.